Let's dive right into this explainer and unpack Chapter 4, the Colonial Era. We're going to explore a truly monumental period in global history, the colonization of India. This is an era that fundamentally reshaped not just the Indian subcontinent, but literally the entire global economy. We're going to look past the usual myths and traditional narratives and instead examine the historical realities of how this era actually unfolded, the key players involved, and the devastating impacts that followed. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, so here's our roadmap. We'll be moving through 1. The age of colonialism. 2. Early Europeans in India. 3. East India Company rule. 4. Economic drain and devastation. 5. Early uprisings and resistance. And finally, 6. The Great Rebellion.
Section 1. The Age of Colonialism. Okay, so by textbook definition, colonialism involves one country taking direct control of another region, establishing settlements, and completely imposing its political, economic, and cultural systems. But the absolutely crucial point here is that this wasn't just about setting up a few innocent trade routes. Not at all. It was about total systemic domination. Starting around the 15th century, European powers like Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands kicked off this frantic race for territorial expansion. And they were driven by a desperate desire for natural resources, new markets, and honestly, in many cases, outright plunder.
There's this famous 1892 cartoon of a British magnate literally straddling the entire continent of Africa while holding telegraph wires, and it brilliantly captures the arrogant mindset of the era. European powers were aggressively expanding their reach across continents under the guise of a civilizing mission. They claimed they were bringing progress to people they demonized as savage or primitive. But when we actually look at the historical evidence, the reality was brutal exploitation. We're talking about the massacre or enslavement of native populations and the total destruction of their traditional ways of life. Section 2. Early Europeans in India. So, what exactly drew these expanding empires specifically to the Indian subcontinent? Well, before the 16th century, India was a staggering economic powerhouse. To put that into perspective, historical estimates suggest India was contributing a massive 25% of the entire world's GDP. They were producing highly sought-after goods, spices, cotton, gems, and Wootz steel. It was this flourishing, vibrant economy with incredibly extensive trade networks. And naturally, that immense wealth made India a massive, glowing target for European colonial ambitions.
If we trace the timeline from 1498 all the way to 1858, we see a steady progression of European involvement. It starts with initial trade, rapidly escalates into armed conflict, and eventually leads to total administrative control and, inevitably, widespread rebellion. The Portuguese were the first to arrive by sea, led by Vasco da Gama, who landed in Calicut in 1498. Now, while he's often remembered as some heroic explorer in the West, his methods on the ground were incredibly violent. He regularly seized, tortured, and killed Indian merchants to establish naval dominance. The Portuguese implemented this pass system called the cartaz, violently forcing all ships in the Arabian Sea to buy their permits. But they didn't just walk in unopposed. They faced fierce local resistance. Take Rani Abaca I of Ulal, for example. She formed alliances specifically to thwart Portuguese takeovers. Her successor, Rani Abaca II, was even reported to have created literal fireballs out of coconut shells to set the Portuguese navy ablaze. No way, right? That is some serious pushback.
But the Portuguese impact wasn't just economic. Alongside that commercial exploitation, they forced cultural and religious changes, which really showcases the darker, systemic reality of their colonial ambitions. In 1560, they set up the Inquisition in Goa, their colonial capital. This was a brutal tribunal that severely persecuted Hindus, Muslims, Jews, and even Christian converts suspected of practicing their original faiths in secret. It was a calculated attempt to completely overwrite the local culture.
Then you have the French, who followed a bit later, establishing their East India Company in Pondicherry in 1674. Under their Governor-General Dupleix, the French pioneered some highly effective, albeit manipulative, colonial strategies. They trained Indian infantry soldiers known as sepoys in European military techniques, and they pretty much mastered the art of installing puppet rulers by intervening in local succession disputes. However, these massive French ambitions were ultimately crushed by the British during a series of conflicts known as the Carnatic Wars. This left the British standing as the absolute dominant European power in India.
Section 3. East India Company rule.
With their European rivals out of the picture, the British East India Company began its aggressive ascent. Let's look at 1757 to see how British dominance was truly secured. Spoiler alert, it wasn't just superior military might. It was through deception and a highly infamous betrayal at the Battle of Plassey. When tensions boiled over with the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, British official Robert Clive identified a disgruntled military commander named Mir Jafar. Clive secretly promised to make Mir Jafar the new Nawab if he betrayed his leader. So during the battle, Mir Jafar's forces literally just stood aside, handing the British a massive, easy victory. In fact, even today in India, the name Mir Jafar is basically a synonym for traitor.
After Plassey, the British rapidly expanded their control using deceptive strategies like the subsidiary alliance. On paper, the expectation was that the British would place a resident in an Indian ruler's court just to offer protection. Sounds nice, right? But the reality? The Indian rulers were forced to pay the massive costs of maintaining those British troops themselves, and they lost their right to conduct their own foreign relations. It was this insidious system that effectively forced Indian rulers to fund their very own subjugation.
Section 4. Economic Drain and Devastation.
Once firmly in power, the East India Company initiated an era of unparalleled economic extraction from regions that British officials, like Robert Clive, had once enthusiastically called the paradise of the earth. The historian Brooks Adams makes a staggering connection here. He explicitly links the massive wealth drained from India directly to the spark that ignited Britain's Industrial Revolution. He states that right after Plassey, the Bengal plunder flooded into London, fundamentally funding the technological and industrial leaps Britain made starting in 1760. As Adams noted, perhaps no investment in history ever yielded the profit reaped from the plunder of India.
But the human cost of this wealth extraction was absolutely catastrophic. The company's agents demanded maximum revenue while investing practically nothing back into local governance or infrastructure. In 1770, Bengal suffered a massive crop failure. Instead of offering relief, the company maintained, and in some cases even increased, their cash tax targets. This merciless policy triggered a famine where an estimated 10 million people starved to death. That was nearly 1/3 of Bengal's entire population wiped out, all just to ensure the company's profit margins didn't dip.
Section 5. Early Uprisings and Resistance.
Naturally, this immense suffering, mass starvation, and the radical restructuring of the Indian economy did not go unchallenged. From the late 18th century onward, resistance was fierce. You had spiritual wandering groups like the sannyasis and fakirs actively rebelling and attacking British treasuries because new land policies restricted their traditional movements, a resistance that later inspired the famous song Vande Mataram. Later, desperate peasants launched the Indigo Revolt, violently rising up against European planters who forced them into debt slavery to grow indigo dye instead of food. And a quick side note on British railways. While we often hear them praised as a blessing of modern infrastructure, they were actually designed primarily to extract raw materials from the interior to the ports, which completely disrupted and destroyed traditional local trade routes.
Section 6. The Great Rebellion.
All of this systemic disruption, economic drain, and deep-seated resentment eventually boiled over into the monumental events of 1857. What the British dismissed as the Sepoy Mutiny, historians now rightfully recognize as the Great Rebellion of 1857. It began when sepoys in Meerut killed their British officers and marched to Delhi to proclaim the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as their leader. This chaotic uprising spread like wildfire to key cities like Lucknow, Jhansi, and Kanpur. It was an incredibly brutal conflict on all sides. In Kanpur, rebel forces under Nana Sahib infamously massacred over 200 British men, women, and children. The rebellion shook the very foundations of colonial rule to its absolute core.
Ultimately, the British used their superior military forces to ruthlessly repress the rebellion, but the shockwaves were undeniable. In 1858, the British Crown had to step in, officially ending the rule of the East India Company. They took direct control over India, marking the beginning of the British Raj. The nature of the occupation shifted from corporate plunder to a formal imperial government, but make no mistake, the systemic extraction of India's wealth continued right along with it.
As we wrap up this explainer on Chapter 4, I really want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. When a colonizer claims a civilizing mission, how do we weigh those grand words against a reality of economic drain, cultural destruction, and devastating famines? History forces us to look past the rhetoric and the polished paintings and look directly at the devastating systemic realities left in their wake. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the colonial era, and as always, keep questioning the history you've been taught.